Okay. Well, hey there. Hi there. Hello there. Welcome back, Alexander and Codex, etc., etc. When I was, when I was young boy, no, when I was 16 or 17, I remember having a conversation with a very dear friend of mine at the time. Her name was and is Sarah. Incredibly intelligent, well-read, analytical, critical human being, uh, a gift to this earth, a gift to this godforsaken planet. Um, yeah, yeah. I could go on, but I'm not going to. We were sitting on a playground, I think, talking about history, talking about politics, as I do. And, I was younger, so my grasp of things was not as it is now. My understanding of things is not as developed or nuanced as it is now. And it's far from perfect now. And I recall she recommending to me this, this little ditty right here. And God, I've been meaning to read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and his other books for about 15 years now. About, nope, that math doesn't check out. 13, 14 years now. And I finally fucking got around to it this year. I bought this shit during the early days of lockdown last year, just as a way to give money to a local leftist book co-op. My hair is just like not recovered from the dry air yet. Leftist book co-op here in Seattle. And like many nerds, like many people, I will buy books with the intention of reading them, and then just kind of put them on a bookshelf and look at them, filled with regret and disappointment. They're like, this seems great. I should read this, and then just like getting a few pages in, putting it aside for the day, and then never touching it again. I'll either read it all in one go or not at all. So this was keeping me company on airplanes, and from the front as a book, right? But like, damn, that boy thick, right? Like this is 600 something pages. Yeah, 688. Not that long, but still pretty fucking long. And this was written, oh god, 1990? 1990s when he wrote this. Let me make sure I'm not wrong about that. People's History of the United States is a 1980. Oh my god, 1980 book by political scientist Howard Zinn. So I'm talking a bit about the book rather than just jumping into reading it because, as always, I feel adamantly that context is important. 1980s were quite a while ago. So Zinn will use language in here, and we're going to skim through or read through a chapter. It depends on what I'm feeling up to. For instance, first chapter is Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Now, in 1980, saying the Indians was a academically appropriate way to talk about indigenous people. Now, the vernacular has changed, right? But the book hasn't been edited to keep with the growing development of social sciences, of political context, stuff like that, right? So there's some hang-ups I had while reading through this. Like some of his numbers for certain groups of people, population estimates for indigenous population of North America or the United States at settlement are kind of on the low end. Academia has just consistently raised those numbers. But for the time being, it's still pretty good. It's still, I mean, especially for 1980, it's incredible. And it feels like a real fucking shame it took me until the year of our Lord 2021 to start reading it. So if you're even vaguely well studied or acquainted at all with the history of the United States with regards to indigenous peoples, as people are much more now than they were back in ye old 1980, a lot of this isn't going to be news. But that's not really the point. The point isn't for this to be news. The point is, if I'm going to talk about, I'm just going through every fucking overlay here, trying to figure out where the hell my display capture is. There it is. I could have streamed a lot of things today, and there's so many fucking hot takes on Indigenous Peoples Day. Like, oh, I'm gonna dunk on Columbus. I'm gonna do this performative thing. Like, my governor is like, the history of Indigenous people is important and gotta keep working for yada 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 yada. But like, none of them really make critical calls for accountability, for reparations, for land back movements, for even analyzing and appreciating that even today, this day, this hour, this minute, right now, there are movements by the Canadian and United States governments, as well as colonizer governments, all over the place, to strip land away from Indigenous nations and peoples, in stark contrast to disregard for and with the treaties, agreements, or laws made with those peoples. Line 3 in Canada and the upper United States is a great example of this. Line 3 being a natural gas, oil. It's another fucking oil pipeline, I think, going through upper Wisconsin and from there to the northwest in Canada. That's just one example. In the United States, over the last 2 years, there have been an incredible amount of rail and industrial sabotages all throughout the northern United States, Pacific Northwest, and southern Canada to resist and fight these encroachments on Indigenous land. And all land is Indigenous land. So, I don't know, how do you make a hot take about that? You don't, right? You don't have to bring something new to the table. Really, the most important thing to do today would be to shut the fuck up and amplify voices of, Indigenous peoples, communities saying what they actually need, the support they actually need. But that's not what I'm doing, obviously. Like, I did it a little earlier today, but because the white people I know just want to talk about Columbus. Let's talk about Columbus. Let's do it. So let's jump in with chapter 1 here. And from the first word, I already have to make a segue. He starts out by saying Arawak. Arawak people, kind of a broad spectrum. Specifically today, a more popular word or more specific word to describe the people that Columbus first met, let's say, it's Taino, Taino. They're in the same lingual group, same cultural group, but there are some important distinctions. But also, keep in mind, these are people who were literally at the tip of the spear of colonization and genocide. So the academic work in trying to figure out who exactly he interacted with, who exactly they were, what their descendants were, practices, beliefs, values, etc., etc., it is greatly erased, and the primary and even secondary sources we have for a lot of these first contact people who had to deal with Europeans, not a lot there, because Europeans, we do love to destroy native works of literature and tradition and history. Anyway, Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches, swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawak ran back to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. They brought us parrots, balls of cotton, spears, and many other things, which they exchanged for glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms, and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron, their spears are made of cane. They'd make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable. European observers were to say again and again for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, and the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. Columbus wrote, as soon as I arrived in the Indies, the first island which we found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information on whatever there is in these parts. The information that Columbus wanted most was, where is the gold? He had persuaded the king and queen of Spain, Queen Isabella, who was she married to? Importantly, it was a dual monarchy at the time. It was Castile and Aragon. Americans like to refer to it as, he was Spanish. Now, he was Italian, working for the Aragonese and Castilian crowns. But whatever, we don't need to understand things. Hello, and the horrors of colonialism today, I see. Well, it's fitting, right? Whatever. Gold, I lost my place. Here. King and Queen of Spain to finance an expedition to these lands. And he did it for cheap, too, compared to earlier bids. I think it was like Columbus's... He first petitioned... Oh, God. I think he initially petitioned someone in Italy, and it was a bunch of princely states at that time, so I can't remember who. I think he had prior petitioned Aragon once or twice, and this was like the third time. I might be misremembering that, for a contract to go explore. For an expedition to the lands, the wealth he expected would be on the other side of the Atlantic, the Indies. And Asia, gold and spices, for like other informed people of his time, he knew the world was round. He could sail west in order to get to the Far East. Spain was recently unified, one of the more new modern nations like France, England, and Portugal. It was, and he's kind of brushing over this, it was unified by this marriage of the crowns, bringing together of two different branches of a political dynasty. Was it the Trastamaras? No, that was earlier. I forget their family. Doesn't matter. But also the conquest of Granada, the end of the Reconquista. 1492 marked not only that, and he'll get into this, but the fall of Constantinople or Istanbul in 1540. A couple decades earlier, to the Ottomans. Its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, who were 2% of the population, owned 95% of the land. Spain had tied itself to the Catholic Church, expelled all of the Jews. Not all of them. Most of them. Many Jews survived in Spain despite the efforts of the Inquisition, despite the efforts of the government, just like they have all over the world when they've been persecuted. Religious minorities... It wasn't a complete expulsion, though. It was a massive expulsion. Driven out the Moors and the Reconquista, like I talked about. Part of the Reconquista was an effort to not religiously convert the Moorish people who lived in Granada, the Granadan people, but also just, like, literally force them to move back to North Africa or kill them. Spain was doing a lot of bloody work at the time, to put it politely. Like other states of the modern world, Spain sought out gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land because it could buy anything. And there was gold in Asia, it was thought. And certainly there were silks and spices, for Marco Polo and others had brought back marvelous things from their overland expeditions in the centuries before. Now that the Ottoman Turks had conquered Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean and controlled those land routes to Asia, a sea route was needed. Portuguese sailors were working their way around the southern tip of Africa, and Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean. Yeah, back to North Africa, right? So back to North Africa because, oh God, like 900 years... no... 1,000 years prior, that's where a lot of people who ended up in Iberia had come from. It's back to North Africa, as if in the same sense of the Welsh people forcing all of the English people to go live in Normandy and Saxony, right? I'm saying it tongue in cheek. Um, the dynasties of Granada and the North African Emirates, particularly in Morocco and Algeria, were for centuries prior, not around the 1400s, but in not too far gone history from that point, there were political unions, there were dynastic unions. At times, they were considered part of the same territory or same caliphates or same. Um, and there hadn't been a caliphate over there in a while. Same. Oh my god, what the fuck is the word? What the fuck is the word? Sheik is too low. It's a title above a sheik, below a caliph. Nope, I don't remember. But just in the same way that it's important to remember that in Corsica and Sardinia Sardinia more than Corsica, had periods in the late Middle Ages, early mid-Middle Ages, where there was North African settlement and Islamic rule there, as well as Sicily and southern Italy. Sultan is probably exactly what I was thinking of, yeah. The Mediterranean, we think of now very popularly as this... I mean, it's a roaming lake, right? Is how so often it's thought about and talked about. But for a long, long time, this was a ever-shifting balance of power. And at this time, in the 1400s, it still is. A shifting balance of power for the incredible wealth coming in terms of spices and better food, frankly, and incense, which was in massive, massive demand at this time. The Catholic Church's use of incense was insanely high. In controlling these things that were necessary to the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year practices of Europe, control over the trade routes in the Mediterranean were essential. So Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearics, I mean... Islam had been as far north as this. It would eventually be as far north as this. So the sense of there being a constant shift and push back and forth is very real. So this idea that the Moors were driven out just like the Jews were driven out of Spain is again an oversimplification. A lot of people fled to Morocco because they wouldn't be killed by crazy fucking Spaniards in Morocco. But a lot of those families stuck around. The same way they did in Sicily, same way they did in Apulia and the rest of southern Italy, same way they did in Sardinia, in Greece, and southern Europe generally. Point being, and Spain also didn't really decide to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean. They knew Columbus's numbers were wrong, that he probably wouldn't reach the Indies, but oh god, how I'm remembering it is he got Isabella to sign off on it with some bullshit about bringing Christianity to the Indies. I might be wrong about this. As I remember it, Columbus went to the king first, who was like, this is fucking stupid, but then he pulled on Isabella's sweet Catholic heartstrings as the most Catholic queen in Europe to back it for good old moral reasons, right? In return for bringing back gold and spices, they promised Columbus 10% of the profits, governorship over newly founded lands, and fame that would go along with his new title. That's a typo. Tilde, title. Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was a merchant's clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, part-time weaver, the son of a skilled weaver, and an expert sailor. He set out with 3 sailing ships, the largest of which was the Santa Maria, perhaps 100 feet long, 39 crew members. Columbus never would have made it to Asia, which was thousands of miles further away than he had calculated, imagining a smaller world, which is important to point out. The rough estimates for the diameter of the Earth and the circumference of the Earth had been fairly well established since ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient India, the ancient Egyptians. Columbus was well understood at his time to be wrong, but like any confident, ignorant white man, he nonetheless endeavored, right? And despite being just incredibly wrong about so much of how he planned what he did, he stumbled his way into fame, which, is there anything more American than that? I don't know. He would have been doomed by the great expanse of sea, but he was lucky. 1/4 of the way there, he came across an unknown and uncharted land that lay between Europe and Asia, the Americas. October in 1492, 33 days since he and his crew had left the Canaries, off the Atlantic coast of Africa, then a colony of Spain, or at least de jure claimed by Spain. Can't remember when they started formal settlement there. Doesn't matter. They saw branches and sticks floating in the water and saw a flock of birds. Signs of land, and then on October 12th, the sailor called Rodrigo saw the early morning moon shining on white sands and cried out. There's an island in the Bahamas, the Caribbean Sea. First man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension of 10,000 maravedis? It's an old currency for life, but Rodrigo never got it, as Columbus had claimed that he had seen a light the evening before, and therefore got the reward. Yeah, the expulsion of the Jewish peoples in Spain is something not... It's very quickly brushed over in American history classes. Like, I remember literally 1 or 2 sentences from high school. So, approaching the land, they were met by the Arawak Indians. Again, Taino people, probably more specifically, but again, it's very hard to say, and the language we use shifts, who swam out to greet them. They lived in village communes, had developed agriculture of corn, yams, and cassava. They could spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. This was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard the ship as prisoners because he insisted that they guide him to the source of the gold. Then sailed to what is now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, the island which today consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, bits of visible gold in the rivers and a gold mask presented to Columbus by a local chieftain led to wild visions of gold fields. On Hispaniola, out of timbers from the Santa Maria, which would run aground, Columbus built a fort, the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. Now known not to be true, military base is interesting. There are signs or suggestions of temporary Scandinavian settlement, or like, there's a possibility that Vikings may have very early on made it to Newfoundland. It's mostly Newfoundland, right? God, I can't remember. There are some things pointing to this was not the first European structure built in the Western Hemisphere, is my point. But again, in 1980, the Leif Erikson Day, I don't even think was a joke then. When was Leif Erikson Day? No, 1929. I'm completely fucking wrong. See, this is why you don't listen to me, you don't listen to streamers, you don't listen to YouTubers, you don't listen to the fucking news. You check the primary source. You always check when somebody makes an unsubstantiated claim, because even if they're mostly right, It can still be technically wrong. Instructions to find and store the gold. He took Indian prisoners, put them aboard his 2 remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. 2 were run through with swords and bled to death. Then the Nina and the Pinta set sail for the Azores and for Spain. When the weather turned cold, their prisoners began to die. Some typos. So this is definitely somebody transcribing this. Officially on this platform, I, by terms of service, cannot suggest people resort to acquiring booty by alternative means, but man, there is a URL right here, and be a damn shame if people just read the book for free instead of buying it. Damn shame. Columbus's report to the court in Madrid was extravagant. He insisted he had reached Asia, it was Cuba, and an island off the coast of China, Hispaniola. His descriptions were part fact, part fiction. Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. Harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers, which the majority contain gold. They make spices, a great number of mines of gold and other metals. The Indians, Columbus reported, are so naive and so free with their possessions that not one has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer it to share it with anyone. He concluded his report by asking for a little help from their majesties, and in return he would bring them back his next voyage as much gold as they need, and as many slaves as they ask. He was full of religious talk. Thus the eternal God, our Lord, gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. Because of this exaggerated report and promises, the second expedition was given 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. The aim was clear: slaves and gold. Went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking natives as captives, but as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found the sailors left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians. After they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and for labor. Now from his base on Haiti, Columbus sent expedition after expedition into the interior. There they found no gold fields, but they had to fill up the ships returning to Spain with some kind of dividend. In the year 1495, they went on a great slave raid, rounding up 1,500 Arawak men, women, children, putting them in pens guarded by Spaniards and dogs, then picked 500 best specimens to load onto ships. Of those 500, 200 died en route. The rest arrived alive in Spain, were put up for sale by the archdeacon of the town, who reported that although the slaves were naked as the day they were born, they showed, quote, no more embarrassment than animals. Columbus later wrote, "Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." Too many of the slaves died in captivity, and so Columbus, desperate to pay back dividends to those who had invested, had to make good his promise to fill the ships with gold. In the province of Sicao, on Haiti, where he and his men imagined huge gold fields to exist, they ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they had brought it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks on strings. Those found without a copper token had their hands cut off and left to bleed to death. The natives had been given an impossible task. The only gold around were bits of dust gathered from streams, so they fled, were hunted down with dogs, and were killed. Trying to put together an army of resistance, the Arawaks faced Spaniards who had armor, muskets, swords, and horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they hanged them, burned them to death. Among the Arawaks, mass suicides began with cassava poison. Infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, suicide, more than half of the 250,000 natives on Haiti were dead. When it came to be clear that there was no gold left, natives were taken on a slave labor by huge estates, and later as the encomiendas. Encomiendas, there we go, encomiendas. Gringo can't pronounce Spanish words. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. By the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 natives left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows none of the original indigenous people or their descendants were left on the island. Yeah, very big Congo moment. Like, people talk about colonialism like, yeah, you know, it was bad. The conquistadors were bad, and like, yeah, that was bad. Columbus is bad. This literally happened in the last century in the Congo by the Belgians. This shit doesn't stop. Why? Capitalism. Capitalism is why it doesn't stop. It eventually, Zin, I can't remember if I think he gets to it a little bit in this chapter. Zin, makes it not so quiet that he has a materialist lens and critique and analysis of much of this stuff, and he gets into it a little bit. The chief source on many matters, and the only source of information about what happened to the islands after Columbus came, is Bartolome de las Casas, who was a young priest participated in the conquest of Cuba. For a time, he owned a plantation on which natives slaves worked, but he gave that up and became a vehement critic of Spanish cruelty. Las Casas described Columbus's journal, and in his 50s, transcribed Columbus's journal, and in his 50s began a multi-volume history of the Indies. In it, he describes the Indians. They are agile, he says, and can swim long distances, especially the women. They're not completely peaceful because they do battle from time to time with other tribes, but the casualties seem small, and they fight when they are individually moved to do so because of some grievance, not on the order of captains or of kings. Women in Indian society were treated so well as to startle the Spaniards. Las Casas describes sex relations. Marriage laws are non-existent. Men and women alike choose their mates and leave them as they please, without offense, without jealousy, nor anger. They multiply in great abundance. Pregnant men work to the last minute and give birth almost painlessly. Up to the next day, they bathe in the river and are as clean and healthy as having been before giving birth. If they tire of their men, they give themselves abortions with herbs at forced stillbirths, covering their shameful parts with leaves or cotton cloth, though on the whole, Indian men and women look upon total nakedness with as much casualness as we look upon a man's head or at his hands. I gotta say, Las Casas and Zin both conflate sex relations with attitudes towards and around nudity. It's a very European. Like, it's not explicitly and specifically European, but this is it's an assumption and connection and association that he's making without pointing out that he's making it. Just because someone's naked doesn't mean that they're a sexual object or want to engage in sexual activity, right? But our puritanical values here conflate the two so that nudity is sexuality. Sexuality is nudity. If you see someone naked or someone is exposing more of their body, then we take that as signaling that they are more or potentially open to sexual engagement, which is not necessarily true. But whatever, 1980, brother. Let's give him a small break, right? Just a small one. We don't have to nitpick everything. The Indians, La Casa says, have no religion, or at least no temples. I adamantly do not believe that they had no religion personally, but the no temples thing, yes. They live in large communal bell-shaped buildings, housing up to 600 people at one time, made of very strong wood, roofed with palm leaves. They prized bird feathers of various colors, beads made from fish bones, and green and white stones with which they adorned their ears and lips. But they put no value on gold and other precious things. They lack all manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and rely exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They're extremely generous with their possessions, and by the same token, covet the possessions of then? Often? What fucking page is this on? This typo is... I can't tell. What the hell? Page 7. Oh god, no, we are... It's page 7 of the PDF, but it is... Page 6, the book. Covet the possessions of their friends. Okay, I could have figured that out. And expect the same degree of liberality. In Book 2 of the Histories of the Indies, Las Casas, who at first urged replacing Indians by black slaves, thinking that they were stronger and would survive, later relented when he saw the effects on black slaves, tells about the treatment of Indians by the Spaniards. It's a unique account and deserves to be quoted at length. Oof. Endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperament of the natives. But our work was to exasperate, to ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. Las Casas tells how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while refused to walk any distance. They rode on the backs of Indians if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In this, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. Total control led to total cruelty. Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by the 10s and 20s, cutting slices off of them to test the sharpness of their blades. Las Casas tells us how 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots, and, for fun, beheaded the boys. The Indians' attempts to defend themselves failed. And when they ran off into the hills, they were found and killed. So, Las Casas reports, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn to for help. He describes their work in the mines. Mountains are stripped from top to bottom, and bottom to top 1,000 times. They dig, split rocks, move stones, and carry dirt on their backs to wash it in the rivers. Where am I at? While those who wash gold stay in the water all the time with their backs bent so constantly it breaks them, and when water invades the mines, the most arduous task of all is to dry the mines by scooping up panfuls of water and throwing it back outside. After 6 or 8 months' work in the mines, which was the time required of each crew to dig enough gold for melting, up to 1/3 of the men died. While the men were sent miles away to toil in the mines, the wives remained to work in the soil, forced into the excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants. Thus, husbands and wives were together only once every 8 or 10 months, and when they met, they were so exhausted and so depressed on both sides that they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died on early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. And for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, children died from a lack of milk, and in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful and fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and I tremble as I write. When he arrived in Hispaniola in 1508, Casas says there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians, so that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and in the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Thus began the history, 500 years ago, of European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. That beginning, when you read Casas, even if his figures are exaggeration, are there 3 million Indians to begin with, as he says, less than 1 million, as some historians have calculated, or more than 8 million, as some others today now believe. It's conquest, slavery, and death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it starts with a heroic adventure. There's no bloodshed. Columbus Day is a celebration. Past the elementary and high schools, there's only occasional hints of something else. Samuel Eliot Morison, the Harvard historian, was the most distinguished writer on Columbus. The author of a multi-volume biography, was himself a sailor who retraced Columbus's route across the Atlantic. In his popular book, Christopher Columbus, Mariner, written in 1954, he tells of the enslavement and the killing. Quote, "The cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide." That's on one page. Buried halfway into the telling of a grand romance. In the book's last paragraph, Morison sums up his view of Columbus. He had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great. His indomitable will, his superb faith in God, and his own mission as the Christ-bearer to lands beyond the seas. His stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. There was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all of his qualities, his seamanship. One can lie outright about the past. One can omit facts which might lead to unacceptable conclusions. But importantly, Morison does neither. He refuses to lie about Columbus. He does not admit the story of mass murder. Indeed, he describes it with the harshest word that one can use: genocide. But he does something else. He mentions the truth quickly, and then goes on to things more important to him. Outright lying, or quiet omission, takes the risk of discovery, which, when made, might arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. To state the facts, however, and then bury them in a mass of other information, is to say that the reader, with a certain infectious calm, yes, mass murder took place, but it's not important. It should weigh very little in our judgments. It should affect very little what we do in this world. It's not that a historian can avoid emphasis of some facts and not others. This is natural to a historian as it is to a mapmaker, who, in order to produce a usable drawing for practical purposes, must flatten and distort the shape of the earth, and choose out of the bewildering mass of geographic information those things needed for the purpose of this or that particular map. My argument cannot be against selection, simplification, emphasis, which are inevitable for his cartographers and for historians. But the mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity for a common purpose shared by all people who need maps. The historian's distortion is more than technical. It's ideological. It's released into a world of contending interests, where any chosen emphasis supports, whether the historian means to or not, some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial, national or sexual. And often, many of those things at once. Furthermore, this ideological interest is not only expressed in the way that a mapmaker's technical interest is obvious. This is a Mercator projection for the long-range navigation for short-range. You better use a different projection. Right? No. It's presented as if all of its readers of history have a common interest which historians serve to the best of their ability. It's not an intentional deception, necessarily. The historian has been trained in a society in which education and knowledge are put forward as technical problems of excellence and not as tools for contending social classes, races, and nations. To de emphasize the heroicism of Columbus and his successors and navigators, discoverers, and to de emphasize their genocide is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly, perhaps. Zinn says unwittingly. I think he's being generous there. I think he's being very generous in saying unwittingly, to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus in absentia. It's too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality, which is why I'm reading this, which is why I'm not going like, haha, let's dunk on Columbus. I did that when I was younger, but he's right. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't contribute anything. You're not amplifying surviving indigenous communities, their voices, their struggles, what they actually want and need today. You're not talking about reform. You're not talking about change. You're not talking about material reality at all. You're just engaging in something that makes you feel better. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, Hiroshima in Vietnam to save Western civilization, Kronstadt in Hungary to save socialism, nuclear proliferation to save us all, that's still with us. One reason that these atrocities are still with us is we've learned to bury them in a mass of other facts. As radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth, we've learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that readers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and of textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of a scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences, and therefore is all the more deadly. The treatment of heroes and their victims, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach in history, in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, of conquerors, diplomats, and leaders, as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as the United States, subject to occasional quarrels and conflict, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It's as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion and the laws passed by Congress, the decision of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and the mass media. History is the memory of states, wrote Henry Kissinger in his first book, A World Restored, in which he proceeded to tell the history of a 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders of Austria and England, ignoring the millions who suffered from those statesmen's policies. From his standpoint, the peace that Europe had found before the French Revolution was restored by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for factory workers in England, farmers in France, colored people in Asia and Africa, women and children everywhere except in the upper classes, it was a world of conquest, violence, hunger, exploitation. A world not restored, but disintegrated. My viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different. We must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities, and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, more often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters, slaves, capitalists, workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioner. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides, which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of the Americas from the viewpoint of the Arawaks. The Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokee, of the Civil War seen by the New York Irish, Mexican War seen by deserting soldiers of Scott's army, the rise of industrialism seen by young women in the Lowell textile mill, the Spanish-American War seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines seen by black soldiers on Luzon. Luzon, it's not French. Luzon. I should be pronouncing the N, but I'm hawing. The Gilded Age is seen by Southern pacifists. The New Deal is seen by blacks in Harlem. Post-war American Empire is seen by peons in Latin America. And so on. To the limited extent that any one person, however much he or she or they strain, can see history from the standpoint of others. My point is not to grieve for victims and denounce their executioners. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past, deplete our moral energy for the present. And the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor might also be a victim. In the short run, insofar human history has only consisted of short runs, the victims themselves, desperate, tainted with a culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still, understanding the complexities, this book will be as skeptical of governments and their attempts, through politics and culture, to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood, pretending to be a common interest. I'll try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they're jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them, but I do remember, in rough paraphrase, a statement I once read. The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you'll never know what justice is. I don't want to invent history or victories for people's movements, but to think that history writing must aim simply to recapitulate the failures that dominate their past is to make historians collaborators, and an endless cycle of defeat. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I'm supposing, or perhaps only hoping, our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion, rather than in its solid centuries of warfare. That, being as blunt as I can, is my approach to the history of the United States. The reader may as well know that before going on. What Columbus did to the Arawaks in the Bahamas, Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro to the Incas of Peru, and the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and the Pequot. The Aztec civilization of Mexico came from the heritage of the Maya, Zapotec, and Toltec cultures, built enormous constructions of stone tools and human labor, developed a writing system and a priesthood, and engaged in, and let's not overlook this, ritual killing and sacrifice of thousands of people to their gods. The cruelty of the Aztecs, however, did not erase a certain sense of innocence when a Spanish armada appeared at Veracruz. A bearded white man came ashore with strange beasts, horses, clad in iron. It was thought he was the legendary Aztec man-god, who had died 300 years before with a promise to return, the mysterious Quetzalcoatl. So they welcomed him with munificent hospitality. This was Hernando Cortez, come from Spain with an expedition financed by merchants and landowners, blessed by the deputies of God, with one obsessive goal: to find gold. In the mind of Moctezuma, king of the Aztecs, I think it's Moctezuma. There's a I forget what it's called. A sound I can't make. in there, or a sound I'm not good at making where the T is. Whatever. Montezuma. There must have been a certain doubt about whether Cortez was indeed Quetzalcoatl, because he sent 100 runners to Cortez, bearing enormous treasures, gold and silver wrought into objects of fantastic beauty, but at the same time begging him to go back. The painter, Dürer, a few years later, described what he saw just arrive in Spain from that expedition. A sun of gold, a moon of silver worth a fortune. Cortez then began his march of death from town to town, using deception, turning Aztec against Aztec, killing with the kind of deliberateness that accompanies a strategy to paralyze the will of a population by a sudden and frightful deed. One might even call that terrorism. One might, yeah. So, in Cholulu, God, this fucking webcams kill me today. And so in Cholulu, he invited the headsmen of the nation to the square. When they came with thousands of unarmed retainers, Cortez' small armies of Spaniards posted around the square with cannon, armed with crossbows, mounted on horses, massacred them, down to the last man. They then looted the city and moved on. When their cavalcade of murder was over, they were in Mexico City. Moctezuma was dead, the Aztec civilization shattered, and in the hands of the Spaniards. And this is what is told in the Spaniards' old accounts. Diphthongs? Yeah, it's a diphthong. I dated a linguist in college. I can't remember. I think you're right. In Peru, that other Spanish conqueror, Pizarro, used the same tactics, for the same reasons. The frenzy in early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil, to pay the bondholders and the stockholders of the expeditions, to finance the monarchical bureaucracies rising in Western Europe, to spur the growth of new money rising out of feudalism, to participate in what Karl Marx would later call the primitive accumulation of capital. These were the violent beginnings of an intricate system of technology, of business, of politics, and culture that would dominate the world for the next 5 centuries. In the North American English colonies, the pattern was set early on, as Columbus had set in the islands of the Bahamas. In 1585, before there was any permanent English settlement in Virginia, Richard Grenville landed with 7 ships. Natives he met were hospitable, but when one of them stole a small silver cup, Grenville sacked and burned the entire village. Jamestown itself was set up inside the territory of a confederacy led by Chief Powhatan. Led by the chief, Powhatan. Powhatan watched the English settle on his people's land. Oh, it's both, okay. Did not attack, maintaining a posture of coolness. When the English were going through their starving time, in the winter of 1610, some of them ran off to join the natives, where they would be at least fed. When the summer came, the governor of the colony sent a messenger to ask Powhatan to return the runaways, whereupon Powhatan, according to the English account, replied with no other than proud and disdainful answers. Some soldiers were therefore sent out to, quote, take revenge. They fell upon an Indian settlement, killed 15 or 16 natives, burned down the houses, cut down the corn surrounding the village, took the queen of the tribe and her children into boats, threw the children overboard, shooting out with and shot out their brains in the water. The queen was later taken off and stabbed to death. Again, by the English own account. You'll note, hopefully, there's no allegation or record of sexual violence here. There was absolutely sexual violence here. But, well, they're not going to report on themselves. They valorized the genocide of peoples, the murder of peoples. The sexual assault, they, didn't make it into the books. 12 years later, the Indians were alarmed as the English settlements kept growing in numbers, apparently decided to try to wipe them out for good. They went on a rampage, massacred 347 men, women, and children. and from then on it was total war. Not able to enslave the natives and not able to live with them, the English decided to exterminate them. Edmund Morgan writes in his early history of Virginia, American Slavery, American Freedom, since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intention, let them settle down, plant their corn wherever they chose, and then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn. Within 2 or 3 years of massacre, the English had avenged the deaths of that time many days over. That day, many times over. Listen, I can't read. And in the first year of the white man of Virginia, 1607, Powhatan had addressed a plea to John Smith that turned out to be prophetic. How authentic it may be is in doubt, but it's so much like so many other statements that it may be taken as, if not the rough letter of the first plea, the exact spirit of it. Yep, there's some typos in here. It keeps autocorrecting die to thee. I've seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I've now grown old and must die soon. My authority must descend to my brothers, Opichapan, Chanako, and Katatov, then to my sisters, and then my 2 daughters. I wish them to know as much as I do, and what your love to them may be like mine to you. Why will you take by force what you may quietly have by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and run into the woods, and then you will starve for wronging your friends. Why are you jealous of us? We are unarmed and willing to give what you ask if you come in a friendly manner, and not so simple as to not know that it's much better to eat good meat, sleep comfortably, live quietly with my wives and children, laugh and be merry with the English, trade for copper and hatches, than to run away from them, and lie cold in the woods, to feed on acorns and roots and trash, and be so hunted I can neither eat nor sleep. In these wars my men sit up watching, and if a twig breaks, they all cry out, "Here comes Captain Smith." So I must end my miserable life. Take away your guns and swords, the cause of all of our jealousy, or you may die in the same manner. When the Pilgrims came to New England, they too were coming out, not to vacant land, but to territory inhabited by tribes of indigenous people. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, created the excuse to take Indian land by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The natives, he said, had not subdued the land, therefore had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right. A natural right did not have a legal standing. Now this I want to touch on. This is really, really fucking important. This legal distinction was used in the Enclosure of the Commons in the UK as well, in England. In English law at the time, in order to maintain or prove or claim ownership over a certain area of land, one must have physical proof in that landscape of having improved it, or having conquered it, or subdued it, is the word he picked out here. The construction of building, the clearing of forests, fences, farmland. But when lands were held in common, not one particular person could claim ownership over the farm, or the field, or the fence, or the farmhouse, right? Depending on the circumstance, or the barn. So, a lack of an individual claim meant that there was a vacuum in ownership, and therefore others could step in and assume or claim ownership. So the same policy made its way to the colonies, and it was used at the same mind-warpingly bizarre moralizing and legalizing of their colonizing and genocide as, well, they have a natural right to it, but they don't have a civil right. Like, they were here, but they didn't do anything with it, so it's ours. The fucked up thing is now we know the complete opposite was true. That the landscapes that Europeans found when we set foot on these continents were not merely the product of evolution and ecology, but in millennia of human natural selection, human selective choices in what crops to grow, when fire should burn, what trees to have in a certain area, what species of predator to allow to exist, what species of megafauna to drive to extinction, right? The landscapes of the United States were, before the first Europeans set foot here, man-made. And when Europeans took over this continent, it was like taking over a house or a lease without any clue as to what was done to build or maintain it. And now in ignorance, we've seen the collapse of ecologies. We've seen what's done when the ways that certain ecosystems in this continent were not maintained a certain way. They collapse and collapse and collapse. And yeah, we're doing a lot to accelerate that as well. But the fucking hubris. The hubris of this is just astounding, and it hasn't gone anywhere. It absolutely has not gone anywhere. The Puritans also appealed to the Bible. Psalms 2:8, "Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession," and to justify their use of force. To take the lands, I cited Romans 13:2. "Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that shall resist shall receive to themselves damnation." This is the wonderful thing about Christianity and about religions with holy texts. You can take two single verses completely out of context from two entirely different books written hundreds or thousands of years apart, put them right next to each other and say, haha, if this, then this, therefore there's like some kind of logical, consistent authorage here. God said this, and then God said this. God said neither of those fucking things, you goddamn idiots. Two random-ass authors did. But you can twist it to mean whatever you want it to mean. Puritans lived in uneasy truth with the Pequot Indians, who occupied what is now southern Connecticut, Rhode Island. But they wanted them out of the way, they wanted their land, and so they seemed to want to establish their rule firmly over Connecticut settlers in that area. The murder of a white trader, Indian kidnapper, and troublemaker became an excuse to make war on the Pequots in 1636. A punitive expedition left Boston to attack the Narragansett Indians on Block Island, who were lumped in with the Pequots, as Governor Winthrop wrote, "They had commissioned to pat to death the men of Block Island, but to put the women and children and bring them away, take possession..." Oh, to put to death, god damn it, it's Old English. "To put to death the men of Block Island, but to spare the women and children, bring them away, take possession of the island, and from thence go to the Pequots and demand the murderers of Captain Stone and the other English, 1,000 fathom of wampum for the damages, and some of their children as hostages, which, if they should refuse, they were to obtain by force." The English landed and killed some of the Indians, but the rest hid in thick forests of the island. The English went from one deserted village to the next, destroying crops. They then sailed back to the mainland, raiding Pequot villages along the coast, destroying crops again. One of the officers of that expedition, in his own account, gives insight into the peoples that they encountered. "The Indians spying us came running in multitudes along the water, crying, 'What cheer, Englishmen? What cheer? What do you come for?' They, not thinking we intended war, went on cheerfully." So the war with the Pequots began. Massacres took place on both sides. The English developed a tactic of warfare used earlier by Cortes and later in the 20th century, even more systematically, deliberate attacks on non-combatants for the purpose of terrorizing the enemy. This is ethno-historian Francis Jennings' interpretation of Captain John Mason's attack on the Pequot village on the Mystic River near Long Island Sound. Mason proposed to avoid attacking Pequot warriors, which would have overtaxed his unseasoned, unreliable troops. Battle as such was not his purpose. Battle is only one way to destroy an enemy's will to fight. Massacre can accomplish the same thing with far less risk. And so Mason had determined that massacres would be his objective. So the English set fire to the wigwams of the village. By their own account, the captain also said we must burn them, and immediately stepping into the wigwam brought out a firebrand. Putting into the moats, which they were covered, set the wigwam on fire. William Bradford, in his History of the Plymouth Plantation written at the time, described John Mason's raid on the Pequot village. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others run through with rapiers, and so they were quickly dispatched, with very few escaping. It was discovered that they destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, streams of blood quenching the flame. And horrible was the stink and the scent of it. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, as they gave the prayers therefore to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, give them so speedy a victory over a so proud and insulting of an enemy. As Dr. Cotton Mather, a Puritan theologian, put it, it was supposed that no less than 600 Pequot souls were brought down to hell that day. The war continued. Indian tribes were used to war against one another, never seemed to be able to join together in fighting the English. Jennings sums up, the terror was very real amongst the Indians, but in time they came to meditate upon its foundations. They drew 3 lessons from the Pequot War. The first, that the Englishman's most solemn pledge would be broken whenever obligation conflicted with advantage. Still true. Number 2, that the English way of war had no limit of scruple or mercy. Still true. Number 3, that the weapons of native make were almost useless against the weapons of European manufacture. These lessons the natives took to heart. A footnote, I'm laughing at chat, I'm not laughing. Obviously, I'm not laughing at this, alright? A footnote in Virgil Vogel's book, This Land Was Once Ours, written in 1972, says, the official figure on the number of Pequots now in Connecticut is 21 persons. 40 years after the Pequot War, Puritans and Indians fought again. This time it was the Wampanoags. You know what? Google, help me out here.
Wampanoag.
That sounds very white. The
Wampanoag.
The Noag part, the ag part sounds very Wampanoag. That sounds incredibly white people-y to me. Just saying that sounds like an English speaker butchering the pronunciation of somebody else's word. This time it was the Wampanoags. I don't like that. I wish so much it was an indigenous speaker. But that's fine. Occupying the south shore of the Massachusetts Bay, who were in the way, also beginning to trade some of their land to the people outside Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their chief, Massasoit, was dead. His son, Wamsuta, had been killed by Englishmen, and the Wamsuta's brother Metacom, where it would be called King Philip by the English, became chief. The English found their excuse, a murder which they attributed to Metacom. They began a war of conquest against the Wampanoags, a war to take over their land. They were clearly the aggressors, but claimed they attacked for preventative purposes. It's a preventative strike. Iraq has WMDs. We have to hit them first. Preemptive strikes, it's worth noting, would not be codified formally in international law until 1830. The precedent would be set in 1836 or 1837 with an incident between the United States and the United Kingdom, and is now the definition of a justifiable preventable strike is you can prove that to the best ability at the time and everything you knew that the threat was real and urgent, and you responded immediately, severely, and specifically to that threat, and limited your intention to that threat, and then left. That's why, after it turned out there were no WMDs in Iraq, the United States and the Bush administration specifically did not say at any point that they were wrong. You kept hearing this line touted out, well, according to our best information at the time, according to our sources at the time, according to our knowledge at the time, to the best of our knowledge, to the best of our ability, and they kept toting this specific language saying it was a justified preemptive strike according to international law because we can pretend that we thought it was the case. Doesn't matter if they actually did, but so long as you pretend that you thought it was the case, it's done. White Manoa. We didn't fuck up. You just fucked up by believing us, right? Well, it's not even that. It's we didn't fuck up. We thought we were right. So therefore you were wrong. No, we thought we were right. And therefore you were wrong. We thought we were right. There's nowhere to go from that. But that's the point, because you just want to keep being able to get away with it. Claimed they were attacked for preventative purposes. As Roger Williams, more friendly to the Indians than most, put it, all men of conscience or prudence ply to windward to maintain their wars to be defensive. Jennings says that the elite of the Puritans wanted the war, but that the ordinary white Englishman did not want it and often would refuse to fight. Crazy. Imagine that, huh? When the natives certainly did not want war, but they matched atrocity with atrocity. When it was over in 1676, the English had won, but their resources were drained. They had lost 600 men. 3,000 natives were dead, including Metacom himself, and yet the raids did not stop. For a while, the English tried softer tactics, but ultimately it was back to annihilation. The indigenous population, estimated to be 10 million, living north of Mexico. Again, this is very outdated. It's higher than that. It's significantly higher than 10 million. This was written in 1980. The figures have only gone up. Let's see here. 60 million is the current popular figure. So that's like the mean or median figure right now. So it's 6 times what it was thought to be 30 years ago, right? Minimum probable population of 60 million. For comparison, Europe's population at the time was 70 to 90 million. So it's roughly comparable to a difference of about 10 to 15 to 20% the population of Europe. We're talking about a scope of a people coming into Europe and doing to all the European nations and ideologies and identities that we have today what was done to the indigenous people here. Instead of France, you have some tiny shitty land in Brittany somewhere called French country. Instead of England, you have somewhere in Northumbria called the British Reserve. Right? That's the scope of what happened. We just do not engage on it. Like he talked about earlier, we mention that it happened and then we move on. We move on and we don't really sit with the scope of it. So he's writing this with a figure a tenth or a sixth of what it actually was, and that's 60 million is still probably a little low. And that's just in North America. Just in North America, not in South America. Huge numbers of natives would die from diseases introduced by whites. A Dutch traveler in New Netherlands wrote in 1656 that the natives affirmed that before the arrival of Christians and before the smallpox broke out amongst them, they were more than 10 times as numerous as they are now. Their population had melted down by this disease, whereas 9/10 of them have died. When the English settled Martha's Vineyard in 1642, the Wampanoags there numbered perhaps 3,000. There were no wars on the island, but by 1764, only 313 Indians were left there. Similarly, Block Island Indians numbered perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 in 1662, and by 1774 were reduced to 51. And again, in likelihood, these numbers are low. These numbers might have been higher. We've learned, this wasn't unknown in the 80s, but it's becoming more and more obvious. There were extensive, complicated trade networks stretching from South America to North America. It was, delayed by time, but peoples traveled to other nations, other tribes, other completely different regions trading things. Like, there have been parrot bones found in Cahokia, which is modern-day St. Louis, where parrots are nowhere nearby. Pearls and seashells from one ocean are found far, far, far away. These were interconnected communities, so when Europeans showed up in the late 1400s, early 1500s with disease, if the Europeans didn't make it somewhere up the coast until 50, 60, 70 years later, that doesn't mean that trade didn't already bring the disease there. It might have been worse once the Europeans settled in Rio. But I'm of the opinion that 60 million might still be low. Europe is very small compared to North America, but it's unsubstantiated, and frankly, we'll never know. Behind the English invasion of North America, behind their massacre of Indians, their deception, their brutality, was that the special drive born in civilizations based on private property. I want to emphasize that again. Behind the massacre, behind the deception, behind the brutality, is the special, powerful drive born in civilizations based on private property. He's saying it quietly here. He's saying it very quietly here. This is a capitalist critique. It was a morally ambiguous drive. The need for space, for land, those were real human needs. But in conditions of scarcity, in a barbarous epoch of history ruled by competition, this human need was transformed into murder of whole peoples. Roger Williams says, "It was a depraved appetite after the great vanities, dreams, and shadows of this vanishing life, great portions of land in this wilderness, as if men were in great necessity, in danger for want of great portions of land, as poor, hungry, thirsty seamen have after a sick and stormy and long starving passage. This is one of the gods of New England, which the living and most high eternal would destroy and famish." Was all this bloodshed and deceit from Columbus to Cortez, from Pizarro, the Puritans, a necessity for the human race to progress from savagery to civilization? Was Morrison right in burying the story of genocide and cite a more important story of human progress? Perhaps a persuasive argument can be made, as it was by Stalin when he killed peasants for industrial progress and the Soviet Union, as it was made by Churchill explaining the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg, and Truman explaining Hiroshima. How can the judgment be made if the benefits and losses cannot be balanced because the losses are either unmentioned or mentioned too quickly? That quick disposal might be acceptable. Unfortunate, yeah, it had to be done to the middle and upper classes of the conquering and advanced countries. But is it acceptable to the poor of Asia, of Africa, of Latin America, to the prisoners in Soviet labor camps, to the blacks in urban ghettos, or the Indians on reservations, to the victims of the progress that benefits a privileged minority of our world? Was it acceptable or just inescapable to the miners or railroaders of America, the factory hands, the men and women who died by the hundreds of thousands from accidents or sickness, where they worked or where they lived? Just casualties of progress? And even the privileged minority, must it not consider, That practicality which even privilege cannot abolish, the value of its privileges. And they became threatened by the anger of the sacrifice, whether an organized rebellion, unorganized riot, or simply brutal individual acts of desperation labeled as crimes by law and state. If there are necessary sacrifices to be made for human progress, is it not essential to hold to the principle that those to be sacrificed must make the decision themselves? We can all decide to give up something of ours. But do we have the right to throw into the pyre the children of others, or even our own children, for a progress which is not nearly as clear or present as sickness or health, life or death? What did the people of Spain get out of the death and brutality visited upon the Indians in the Americas? Well, for a brief period of history, there was the glory of a Spanish empire in the Western Hemisphere. As Hans Koning sets it up in his book Columbus, his enterprise, for all the gold and silver shipped to Spain did not make the Spanish people richer. It gave their kings an edge in the balance of power, for a time, a chance to hire more mercenary soldiers for their wars. They ended up losing those wars anyway. All that was left was a deadly inflation, a starving population, the rich richer, the poor poorer, and a ruined peasant class. Beyond all that, how certain are we that what was destroyed was inferior? Who are these people who came out on the beach and swam to bring presents to Columbus and his crew, who watched Cortez and Pizarro ride through the countryside, who peered out of the forests at the first white settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts? Columbus called them Indians because he miscalculated the size of the earth. In this book, I too call them Indians with some reluctance, because it happens too often that people are saddled with names given by them by their conquerors. And yet, there is some reason to call them Indians, because they did come perhaps 25,000 years ago. We actually know it's a lot longer now. Earlier this year, actually, it was demonstrated that human settlement of North America got pushed back significantly further. There have been people here for a long time. Crossed the land bridge of the Bering Strait, later to disappear underwater to Alaska. They then moved southward, seeking warmth and land, and a trek lasting thousands of years, taking them into North America, Central and South America. In Nicaragua, Brazil, and Ecuador, their petrified footprints, and in the United States now, can still be seen along with Prince Bison, who disappeared 5,000 years ago. So they must have reached South America, at least that far back. Widely dispersed over the great landmass of the Americas, they numbered approximately 75 million people by the time Columbus came. Again, this is half of what it was, because he's saying for the entire continent. Perhaps 25 million in North America. We now know it's around 60 million, so this is closer to 150, 170 million in total on both continents. Total. Responding to the different environments of soil and climate, they developed hundreds of different cultures. Perhaps 2,000 different languages, more actually. The United States, Central South America, Canada have an incredible... Nah, come on, man. All right. Okay. This is soft imperialism. This is very soft imperialism. Like, oh yeah, there's indigenous speakers of some stuff here. Or Spanish? Do you just have Spanish there? Oh, you absolutely do. Wow. Okay, no, this is just like partially Spanish. Not even. Oh, I'm sorry. They're other. The Navajo Nation here is just other. Okay, yeah, no, very cool. The point I was trying to get at is this. And this is just, we know, extant surviving languages, or at least in written history. Tenochtitlan, biggest city in the world. Yeah, Tenochtitlan was the largest city in the fucking world at this time. Mexico City is still one of the largest, but was at this time. And it's just, he doesn't even talk about that here because I don't think he knew that. We love to talk about or give the impression that North America was unimproved, right? It wasn't subdued, like, because of this legal concept, but it was thoroughly subdued. It was heavily peopled. It was incredibly man-made. Oh, weird. Why are there languages in here? Why is there just a lot of blank space? Well, that's where Whitey made it before people could run away. And yeah. Why are there so many languages in California? There aren't. What we see in California is probably more representative of what the entire fucking map looked like before we got here. There were language groups that were closer together, but the kind of lingual diversity, cultural diversity here is suggestive of what it was like overall. They perfected the art of agriculture, figured out how to grow maize. They didn't just figure out how to grow maize. They took maize from a grass into a vegetable. They took something that was wheat looking. It looked like wheat. And they turned that son of a bitch into these thick-ass boys on a cob, right? Which cannot grow by itself and must be planted, cultivated, fertilized, harvested, husked, and shelled. They ingeniously developed a variety of other vegetables and fruits, as well as peanuts and chocolate, tobacco, and rubber. On their own, the natives were engaged in a great agricultural revolution that other peoples in Asia, Europe, and Africa went through at the same time. While many nations remained or became nomadic hunters and gatherers, egalitarian communes, others lived in more settled communities where there were more food, larger populations, more division of labor, more surplus to feed chiefs and priests, more leisure time for artistic and social work, for building houses. About 1,000 years before Christ, while comparing constructions going on in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Zuni and Hopi of what's now New Mexico had begun to build villages consisting of large terrace buildings nestled amongst cliffs and mountains. The Hohokam in Arizona, there were 2 or 3 other very major active cultures at the same time. We're doing the same thing. Seriously, the longer time goes on, the more shit we find, the more evidence of serious stationary, though temporary, settlement in the Americas. And if you read about Cahokia, if you read the stories about why people left Cahokia, if you read the stories about why some of these cities in the modern American Southwest were abandoned, were overuse of the land generally. Farming too much, depleting the soil, deforestation, desertification, modern issues that were experienced and brought the United States to its knees in the 1930s. Could have been learned about hundreds of years ago if you just believed the stories of the people you were conquering, killing, and driving to extinction. Before the arrival of European explorers, indigenous people were using irrigation canals, dams, using ceramics, weaving baskets, making cloth out of cotton. There were road networks in the United States that rivaled those that Rome made in size and scope. It's comparable to a T. California is what happens when Spain runs out of energy and men to genocide all the people. Yeah, like, they get about halfway up through California, claim all of it, and oh man, my bitrate went to heck. It's back, never mind. Bitrate went brrr. Yeah, California's like when colonialism gets too sleepy, right? And it still has many atrocities that have happened there that I've talked about in the past. By the time of Christ and Julius Caesar, there were developed in the Ohio River Valley a culture called now the Mound Builders, natives who had constructed thousands of enormous sculptures out of the earth, sometimes in the shape of humans, or birds, or serpents, sometimes at burial sites, sometimes as fortifications. One of them was miles long, including over 100 acres. These mound builders seem to have been part of a complex trading system of ornaments and weapons from as far off as at least the Great Lakes and the far west and the Gulf of Mexico. Around 500 AD, as this mound builder culture of the Ohio Valley was beginning to decline, another culture was developing in the west, in the Mississippi Valley, centered on what's now St. Louis. Had advanced agriculture, included thousands of villages, built huge earthen mounds as burial and ceremonial places near a vast metropolis. It may have had at least 30,000 people. Numbers actually gone up from that figure, but it's a lot. The largest mound was 100 feet high, with a rectangular base larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Larger than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And it's not as easy as just putting up dirt. This is in a floodplain. So they layer these mounds in different materials to make it so that moisture drains through the mounds in certain ways so as to not erode the mound or the land around it. They're incredible feats of understanding of the local geography, of engineering. In this city known as Cahokia, there were tool makers, hide dressers, potters, jewelry makers, weavers, salt makers, copper engravers, and magnificent ceramists. One funeral basket was made of 12,000 shell beads. To copy paste a YouTube comment of mine, Mayan astronomy was actually ahead of the old world, and the writing system was as complex as modern Mandarin. The Nocticlan had a larger population than any non-Chinese city, if not the largest in the world. Yeah, the only contender is maybe oh my god. It's in Iraq. It starts with a B. Yes, you're right, is my point. It was the most, if not one of the most. One of the most, if not the most. The Incan Mita system allowed for infrastructural expansion at a pace feudal lords can only dream of. Through selective breeding, turned several crops into what we know them today. Yeah, it's incredible. Just incredible what was accomplished here. And the erasure and denial of those accomplishments for the purposes of legitimizing colonialism and legitimizing white settlement of these continents is egregious and absurd. From the Adirondacks of the Great Lakes to what's now Pennsylvania and upper New York lived the most powerful of the northeastern tribe, the League of the Iroquois, which include the Mohawks, the people of the Flint, the Oneatas, the people of the Stone, the Onondagas, the people of the Mountain, the Cayugas, the people of the Landing, and the Seneca, the Great Hill people. Thousands of people bound together by common Iroquois language. In the vision of the Mohawk chief Ilawatha, the legendary Decanawida. Alright, Google. Please don't have a white person pronouncing it. Okay. No pronunciation guide. Fine. We bind ourselves together by taking hold of each other's hands so firmly and forming a circle so strong that if a tree should fall upon it, it could not shake nor break it, so that our people and grandchildren shall remain in a circle of security, of peace, and of happiness. In the villages of the Iroquois, land was owned in common and worked in common. Hunting was done together, the catch was divided amongst the members of the village. Houses were considered common property and were shared by several families. The concept of private ownership of land, of homes, was foreign to the Iroquois. French Jesuit priests who encountered them in the 1650s wrote that no poorhouses were needed amongst them, because they are neither mendicants nor paupers. Their kindness, humanity, and courtesy not only makes them liberal with what they have, but causes them to possess hardly anything except for in common. Women were important and respected in Iroquois society. Families were matrilineal, that is, a family line went down the female members, whose husbands joined their family, while sons who married then joined their wives' families. Each extended family lived in a longhouse. When a woman won a divorce, she set her husband's things outside of the door. Families were grouped in clans, and a dozen or so more clans might make up a village. The senior women of the village named the men who represented the clans at village and tribal councils. They also named 49 chiefs who were the ruling council for the five-nationed confederacy of the Iroquois. The women attended clan meetings, stood behind the circle of men who spoke and voted, and removed the men from office if they strayed too far from the wishes of the women. The women tended the crops, took general charge of the village affair, while the men were hunting or fishing. I almost said fisting. Fishing! And since they supplied the moccasins and food for warring expeditions, they had material control over military matters. As Gary B. Nash notes in his fascinating study of the early America, Red, White, and Black, thus power was shared between the sexes, and the European idea of male dominance and female subordination in all things was conspicuously absent in Iroquois society. Children in Iroquois society, while taught to be the cultural heritage of their people and solidarity with the tribe, were also taught to be independent. Not to submit to overbearing authority, they were taught equality in status and the sharing of possessions. The Iroquois did not use harsh punishment on children, nor did they insist on early warning, weaning, or early toilet training, but gradually allowed children to learn self-care. All of this was in stark contrast to the European values as brought over by the first colonists, a society of rich and poor, controlled by priests and governors, by male heads of families. For example, the pastor of a Pilgrim colony, John Robinson, thus advised his parishioners how to deal with their children. "And surely there is in all children a stubbornness and a stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must in the first place be broken and beaten down, so that the foundation of their education, being laid in humility and tractableness, other virtues may, in their time, be built thereon." Gary Nash describes Iroquois culture: no laws and ordinances, no sheriffs or constables, no judges or juries or courts or jails or law apparatuses of authority in European societies were to be found in the northeast woodlands prior to European arrival. Yet boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. Though they prided themselves on autonomous individualism, the Iroquois maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. Those who stole another's food or acted invalorously were shamed and ostracized from their community until they atoned for their actions and demonstrated to the satisfaction of their peers that they had morally purified themselves. Not only the Iroquois, but other indigenous tribes behaved in similar ways. In 1635, Maryland Indians responded to a governor's demand that if any of them killed an Englishman, the guilty one should be delivered for punishment according to English law. The response of the natives was, "It is a manner among us that if any accident should happen, we do redeem the life of a man that's so slain with 100 arms length of beads. Since you are here strangers and come to our country, you should rather conform yourselves to our customs than impose yours upon us." So Columbus and his successors were not coming to an empty wasteland, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, where relations amongst women, men, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. There were people without written language, but with law. Their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on. Oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, the intensity of will, of independence, of flexibility, of passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, American scholar who lived amongst natives in the 1920s and 1930s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, "Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace." Perhaps there is some romantic mythology in that. Yes, there is. There's romanticism. But the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, put together recently by American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it's enough to make us question, for that time, and for ours, the excuse of progress, the annihilation of races, and the telling of history from the standpoint of conquerors and leaders of Western civilization. So that's chapter 1 of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I think it's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it's good. It's damn good for the time, and it's damn good for today. I'd love to see an updated version, but of course I do. That's all I really wanted to read today. It's been almost 2 hours. I knew that would take me a minute. I had a feeling it'd take a while. Oh, God. I'd keep reading, but the next chapters kind of get away with that. As we can see into the void there. Burp. If we go back to the index, this is really where they focus on indigenous people for the most part. Talks about race, persons in mean and vile condition. Oh God, I forget which these chapters are, but generally he tries to jump from subject to subject. I've only made it to the intimately oppressed. I've only made it to chapter on women so far, and I got a ways to go. We do love to see this. Love to see chapter 13, Socialist Challenge. I got your socialist challenge right here. Gestures to genitals. Challenge you to date me, nerds. Yeah, that's a book. Here's a URL that... Oh, yeah, hold on. Good. That's the book. Here's a URL. Here's a URL that you definitely shouldn't go to, because you shouldn't pirate a book, because the platforms I am on do not allow me to advocate for piracy. So I am therefore not advocating for piracy. I am clearly saying, in the words coming out of my mouth, that you should not go to mvlindsay.wordpress.com/2005/08/peoples-history-zin-1980.pdf if you want to read this book. I am absolutely not saying that. I am very clearly saying the opposite of that. You wouldn't download a car, would you, kids? I think that's it. I don't have any way to wrap that up more succinctly than Zen does. Thanks for hanging out. I know I haven't been engaging with chat very much. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to respond to some shit I ignored in chat. I'm sure they're not around anymore because it was an hour and 40 minutes ago. But it's fine. It's fine. So, YouTube, until tomorrow, I'm going to say... Well, tomorrow. Until later, I'm going to say toodaloo, take care, see you then. Till then, bye-bye. See, I remembered how it went. But also, like, fuck you and good night. Wasn't bad either. Oh, and of course the fucking stop button's not working. Classic.